Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Endpoint Security, What's Your Posture on Zero Trust? And today, as the title says, we're going to be talking about endpoint security and specifically PAW, Microsoft PAW. So I am Miguel Flegman, the co-founder and CEO of Kitos. Ex-Microsoft was doing identity and PKI stuff at Microsoft, and then left co-founded Kitos and started doing passwordless tools for the world. So today I'm glad to have Elliot and Alex. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Thank you, Hugo. As you said, I'm Alex Kessel. I am one of the co-founders of Moot. Elliot over here is one of our other co-founders. I'm also an ex-Microsoft employee, mostly focused in the customer experience side of the house for deploying all the Microsoft tools from a Microsoft perspective. And then we just saw a lot of easy to fix issues with security and deployments and using tools, and that's where we left to start doing what we were doing today. Elliot, I'll throw it over to you.
Hey there. Thanks for the warm intro, Alex. I'm Elliot Huffman. I am also an ex-Microsoft employee. It's good to be in good company. I used to be a global cybersecurity leader at Microsoft. I led teams globally on architecting and designing the latest, greatest security architecture, and I was also the lead author of Azure security best practices internally at Microsoft, amongst a wide variety of other things. But I have left to join Alex to build Moot, and Kitos is a great partner of ours, and they handle stuff that we don't handle, and we think we're a good fit for them. So that's pretty much it. Thanks.
So first of all, so let's talk about why PAW and everything. So usually this comes up when people ask me, oh, you're going to be running PKI for us. How secure are you? And I start with the basics, like, oh, we monitor our subscriptions. We actually have an open source tool that helps you monitor the RBAC for the subscriptions. Then I say we use a different identity. So we don't use our corporate identity to access our production. So basically, if you hack my email, you don't get access to our production. We use just in time and so on. People are like, okay, I can see that. And then I say, and we use a completely different device that is just locked down, and you can only use to access Azure with our secure identity. And that's where I get the weird look in the meeting being like, what are you talking about? What is that and why it's needed? You're talking about unphishable credentials. You're saying that with unphishable credentials, I can't get phished. So why are you going so far out to kind of protect yourself? So I brought in the experts to talk about it. So yeah.
No, I appreciate that, Hugo. I think it's we also get this question fairly frequently, mostly because in the world of digital, everything moved to scale and flexible virtual deployments a while ago for a lot of privileged security, a lot of access. That realm of security moved away from the idea that you have a specific device for a special purpose. And as you can see on this little slide that we have splashed up here, really what we think through in terms of why specialized endpoints are required or why you need to think about these strategies differently is that currently most of the forms of breaches that we see are all abusing pretty standard best practice knowledge or systems of infrastructure that haven't been deployed fully yet at organizations that are completely preventable. So these aren't even sophisticated 0 days or anything like that. They're just, oh, yep, you did not patch this one thing. Now you're busted. We have your user. We're going to escalate that user and so on. Eric Mannon is a security MVP that is fantastic. And he put it fantastically here, where the idea of ransomware as a service, it's practically automated, where all they're doing is taking advantage of preventable infrastructure. So if you have weak infrastructure, we can take advantage of it. We being attackers, and that's what we're trying to fix, is those preventable attacks that you can have with infrastructure. So in general, I started alluding to this here, but in terms of how breaches work, I'm sure folks are fairly familiar with the attack pattern, but generally speaking, once you've discovered a vulnerability or way in, we see the same pattern. And not to drain this slide, but people escalate their privilege, and then they start abusing that privilege or laterally traversing to go find the golden ticket, who will allow them to exfil data, cause disruption to the actual business, allow them to execute ransomware, which done at a meaningful level requires a privileged credential. And then, exfiltrating that data, getting out of there and finishing off whatever impact they want to deliver. And this is not a very, surprising pattern at all. It's very much what we see out there, right, Igal? I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit in terms of, it's pretty much how did it happen? Oh yeah, nope, the same thing happened again. We all have seen this pattern. And the thing about this pattern is it uses all these sources of vulnerability that can be addressed, but are all part of the IT operations. So, Elliot, I don't know if you want to kind of jump into the right side here around the details of how we typically see this traversal and breach with things like malware, token theft, and all that.
Yeah, sure. Normally we see some type of entry. It commonly comes in the form of email, but more recently I've also seen a lot of watering hole attacks where people are clicking on poisoned search results or malvertising. It's like an advertisement, but it's actually malware that it leads you to. Or you click on one of those types of common internet threats and you get it on the computer. And then you have some sort of C2 software. It's usually something like Cobalt Strike that you see executing on a computer. That's what the bad guys are all using these days. But it could be a variety of other stuff. You could also have threat actors that are spear phishing or spear attacking targeted attacking your organization. If you have a, say, more highly sensitive organization that might be a nation state target. One of our customers is a sovereign nation and they have to defend against stuff like that. And
sorry, Elliot. I want to interrupt you a little bit because it's not just governments anymore. Like we laugh a lot internally at Ketos. We get spearphished all the time, even from text messages. One person in my marketing team, like literally his mom has gotten text messages being like, "Hey, this is Igal Fleckman. Text me ASAP. I need you to do something." And like we laugh because we're like, well, that's not us, but we
don't need to do
anything. But like part of our onboarding now is like literally screenshots of that and being like, hey, even Ketos, a startup is getting spearphished. So it's no longer just, oh, it's a government. It's going everywhere.
And I think this
absolutely private sector supports the government, and private sector is hit just as much, if not more, than the government. I totally agree. Sorry about that, Alex. Go for it.
No. All I was saying is I think, the type of idea that, again, we were talking about ransomware as a service. We're all familiar with automated attacks and bots that are crawling, looking for certain CVEs. I think it was a 15 to 90 minute window to patch or something, and that keeps shrinking. As soon as critical vulnerabilities actually, announced, you have very little time before you'll start getting people probing and scraping for who has not updated this, right? And I think with the where AI is going and the language models that we see, it's easier to spearfish,
yeah.
But it's easier to automate that spearfishing because you don't need anybody to really, man the station, as it were. You can just start spraying out messages that sound fairly conversational, especially for folks in the tech field. Pretty easy bar to hit. So I think there's definitely a concern for that automation coming down the line in the future. I mean, we're already getting that all the time.
And I think that perfectly transitions us to the next. It's like, okay, there's no way that humans can keep up with the AI. Like there's no way, because there's going to be that perfect spearfish message that it's going to get you to even us. We're security professionals. We're cognizant of this. And it might get you, like you might be tired, you might be something, and all of a sudden you get an email from Alex and you go for it. So if the human can't do it, let's talk about how we can prevent it.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean that's really at the core of what we do. And actually, Yigal, if you could skip to the next slide, I think
Yeah,
that one
yeah.
might be important here. In terms of the strategies that we see and that we ran into at Microsoft and what we're running into now, we're always running into the same phrasing and the same methodology, that when you play it out in a scenario does not scale with what we're seeing with AI, with what we're seeing with just your attack surface. And primarily everyone sings detection response, like how quickly. Most all the reports on breaches and vulnerability management, IBM's, Verizon's, they all list mean time to detect and respond to a threat, but never how could we just make this not a threat. And they consider it a victory to drop response time to an attack from 117 days down to 79 days. That is great, but I mean that's still a ton of time. And these attacks, most of them can be prevented without having to, scale up your detection capabilities, your security team, and everything to meet that. Because, right now it's like 40% cybersecurity positions are open in the field. I mean, there's not enough people to staff this, even if we could all afford to hire them to staff it,
Well,
which is another problem. Right.
and something I want to highlight that you just said there is we're saying 79 days to detect.
Right.
And that's to detect. That's not to mitigate. That's to realize that someone is in your
That's up in
network.
the 200s. Yeah.
So you're saying that like if someone is in your network for 3 months and you detect them, you're doing great. You're like way above average. So obviously, as a whole industry, we're not doing great. We have to prevent it. If it's gonna take 3 months of someone poking around in your network to be caught, we got to do something to prevent it. And I think that's where you were gonna go next.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, the idea for endpoint security in general and kind of how do we architect ourselves properly has always been zero trust. The problem with that is zero trust doesn't necessarily assume breach. And if we adopted a mindset of let's assume that there's somebody in our environment and fix our architecture that way, it's a different mindset. Now we're not worried about keeping them out and in. We're just kind of assuming, nope, they're already in. How do we mitigate any impact that could happen from somebody who is in? And this is kind of like the advanced level of zero trust, or just the next iteration logically, of where we go from here. And that's really where we think endpoint security has a massive level of impact relative to effort, because when we're talking about assuming breach, we're talking about reducing that attack surface by an order of magnitude so that you don't have to detect and respond to as much. Because if you can say that it doesn't matter or we can prevent it outright, you've saved your team that's already overloaded a lot of time and trouble, which is dividends for everybody here. So it really comes down to two different types of endpoints. And Elliot, I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away here and kind of talk about how we view the two different enterprise and privileged endpoints here. So just let me know when you need to switch to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. So we generally have two different primary viewpoints. There's technically a third one called specialized, but we're not going to touch on that. So enterprise in this case doesn't necessarily mean the scale of your company. This is more of your end users. So for your end users, we generally recommend to have easy wins that don't interrupt productivity. Stuff like Credential Guard, BitLocker, in the case of Windows, or I'm forgetting the name on Apple's platform for their disencryption. But you get the easy wins that are transparent to your workloads and don't cause any overhead at the end of the day. So you try to turn on all that as much as possible and generally reduce your surface area for attack a little bit for your end users. Things like MFA or FIDO2 keys, like what Keydos can offer for your end users. That's great also. For the other side, though, there are certain users in your organization that if they get compromised, they can absolutely destroy it, such as people with IT admin rights. Those people control all the computing systems and have access to anything they want to if they really wanted to. So the privileged users can also extend to people who have elevated access to, say, bank accounts or high valued assets. It isn't just IT admin access. So we would generally recommend, I think we generally see about, what is it, 1% of an organization, Alex? I'm forgetting the percentage off the top of my head. I think it's
Typically, yeah, with the
1%
permissions.
of, yeah, if we look at all privileged users, it's usually 1% or less that have the ability to absolutely decimate and destroy an organization, whether from a public perspective or public opinion, what's it called, marketing, from the public opinion side of things to the actual technical inner workings or financial livelihood of your organization. It's usually 1%. And these users are what we target with the creme de la creme of security. You turn on things like whitelisting or allow listing, as it's now called, so that you can't just run any application. It's just a known set of good applications. So you can't bring your own exe and get a vulnerability that way. You have to play by the rules of your management system. You turn on things like credential partitioning so that only this one user can log into the device. So that if a user that's outside of the device gets compromised, they can't make their way in to this privileged boundary. So they can't do something called privileged escalation, or lateral traversal is another way to look at it. So lateral traversal usually goes hand in hand with privilege escalation. So
and Agal, this is the specialized device that you use, right?
Yeah.
This is the Microsoft PAW. If you want to switch to the next slide, we call this PAW in general, and to use another fantastic Eric Mannon phrase that he coined, the zero fun device. And the way that we kind of think about this, a lot of folks, the paradigm for privileged security is typically this idea of let's secure the privileged box. And this is your PAM solutions. This is your, secure jump box, or, your tunnel that you're trying to keep secret, or, whatever you're doing to protect your privileged endpoints right now, to not let anybody take over or do the privilege activity. The only problem is that most of the time we have this idea of you can bring any device into the environment to then conduct privilege activities. And so it's this kind of unsecure, potentially compromised enterprise endpoint that is very difficult to protect at scale. And then they get to access your privileged workloads. What we're doing is flipping that script and saying, here you have a privileged workstation that is special, that can only do privileged things and is well protected by that extreme allow list and everything else that you're doing. That way we know it's not going to be compromised over the internet. It's not going to be compromised by ransomware.exe, or anything else. It can't click on malicious links because it's not receiving malicious links, because it's got, very restricted internet. You only need the Azure portal or whatever you're using in your environment. That's what you can access on here. And then you take that lockdown and let them access a general enterprise environment. It doesn't really make sense to put the thing that can take down your company under the same protection as, one of your sales reps. It not the same.
And one main thing that I want to clarify this, and Alex, you and I have talked about this way too much, is the order of operations matters here.
Yes.
You cannot have your corporate device RDP into a managed secure device that can't run anything. Like the source clean source principle requires you that the source device, like the one that the engineer has their hands on, is a secure lockdown. So like having a cloud paw or something like that really breaks that security, because if you have a compromised device, it might not be able to run exes on the secure device, but it can run some PowerShell commands on the back end to your servers or something like that, or still a token. So it's very important that the clean source device is actually the paw. And then you can RDP. You can have like an RDP that goes into your corporate device, and that's where you Google the solution, and that's where you talk to your colleagues over email. So, and that's a main thing, because a lot of times, and even at Microsoft, I used to hear this a lot of, well, it really impacts my productivity. And honestly, if you do it properly, doesn't.
No.
If you're RDPing into a corporate device and you have everything there, you know, like it looks almost the same. Like you know, like you might not have the best audio quality, but other than that, you have the same things. You just are in a clean, secure device, and it's
Yeah.
something that I really like. And that it was in a talk internally at Microsoft. It was like right now we see it as something crazy, but also in the 60s, people saw something crazy that it was surgeons washing their hands before entering the operating room.
Yep.
And today you would not have surgery if the surgeon didn't wash their hands before entering the operating room. So now with zero trust, it's something that like, yeah, right now you see it as crazy, but in 10 years you're going to be like, can't
Of
believe
course
we
we
were
didn't do that.
managing
Yeah.
things without pause.
Yeah. No, I mean that analogy is spot on of the surgeons washing hands, right? It's not how we've built the ecosystem of what it means to manage IT architecture. You know, at the core, you know, when early 90s and everyone else when we were all starting to get into this field, you know, we're just a bunch of guys on computers, you know, instead of hanging out in high school wanting to build stuff and get our hands in the matrix, right? And that's still how a lot of it sysadmins operate, is like, let me put myself all over the matrix. The problem is that the machine they use to do that can be compromised in so many ways, and is compromised in so many ways. It's not a question of if, it's when. And one person against everyone is quite a ways. If you want to jump back to the breach slide, that would actually be a fantastic illustration here, since we skipped it earlier. We often get the idea of, somebody says, well, I don't know that we have data that's needing this level of security, or something along the lines of like, why would we specialize the device? It's the tool for the trade. If you're an admin, this is the tool that you need so that your company does not get breached. Because there are examples of, on here, LastPass, they had 4 engineers. This was their second breach. I think they've had another one since then. We love you, LastPass, but use a paw. But they had 4 engineers that had their corporate vault, just 4. And they one of them used a home computer, which is a completely, relatively unprotected endpoint, that, is not controlled, is definitely not a paw. And they had connections to a Plex server that had a 3-year-old vulnerability on it. And then an attacker basically used that vulnerability to get onto the home computer, and then just waited for one of the 4 people that could do this to log in to the corporate vault, and then they exfilled all the data of the passwords there and everything. And it's like, there were 4 people that could do this. They found who it was, and then they abused their home machine that could connect because it was not specialized in any way, and boom, they got away with it. So this is not a question of will they find out or will they find the person. We need to make sure that that person can't be found. And PAWs not generally available on the internet, right? You're not going to find them the same way that you would find everything else. So I think that's a pretty critical one to point out here.
Yeah, and and also it shows how like like one little thing can really break. Like it was a Plex server and everything. So now, kind of jumping, since we're running a little bit out of time, is this included? Like it sounds very complicated. It sounds like I'm gonna need 8 different tools to run a PAW. Like, is it really that hard? How much extra am I gonna have to pay Microsoft? Like, what's the deal here?
Always the question, yeah. No, the beauty of this is that it's a strategy change, not a tool change. So this is already included. If you have E5 or the E3 plus EMS suite for Microsoft, you can deploy PAWs in your environment, no problem. That is what you need. So that's pretty much the license level that most folks are at. So from there, all we're doing is architecting these tools to get you to a PAW, and it can be done on your own. This is actually what we specialize in, so we make it as much of a one-click option as possible to get this security and to manage it easily so that it's not a headache. But we think that there are too many tools on the market. We don't need to introduce new ones. The ones you have work great as long as we can focus on implementing them properly. And that's really what a PAW is the proper implementation of the tools you have to get kind of that 80% benefit for 20% of the effort. which is really critical. So yeah, this is already included in what most everybody should have out the gate.
Cool.
Yes, the multi-stack. I forgot to mention that. There's always a level of question over. We have, multi-cloud environment, we're GCP, everything else. You can use these with a PAW, right? We use the Microsoft Stack specifically because we find it to be very effective and efficient for creating PAWs and making it easy. But you can still have these other tools in your environment if they need to be there. We just generally always bring up that adding more stacks lowers the amount of time you're going to actually spend on using it properly, expands your attack vulnerabilities and what you have to manage, and also again critically the skills of your team have to be cranked way up. So PAWs, they can be cross-platform. If you manage a PAW on Microsoft, you can still connect it to GCP and have that admin do everything they would do, or AWS and have them do everything they would do. It's all the same. We just use Active Directory as the source of truth for our PAWs that are deployed. But this is an idea, not a product, right? It's not the tool, it's the architecture. So essentially, all we're doing is utilizing whatever tools are available on the stack to create that PAW. Which is another critical component because some folks think, this is very platform specific. It's really not. It's very strategy specific. You don't need to buy all the best of breed tools because most of the platforms have all the ones you need right there, and you can benefit from that unified stack out the gate.
And that's something that is really cool. Like usually, like when you see a new concept or something in cybersecurity, it's like, all right, how many millions do I have to
right
put out? And it's like, no, you're already paying for this. And that's something that actually used to get a lot of Microsoft people mad because like we would talk to them, like Microsoft customers, because like we would talk to them and they're like, oh my God, like that's awesome. We want to implement it. Like how much do we have to pay? And it's like, well, you're already paying for it. You just have to click those settings. And
Yep.
I think that's where like Moot comes in and says like, hey, instead of spending weeks kind of like trying to figure out, okay, which flags do I have to turn on? Is my PAW actually secure, or did I miss this one critical thing that's actually how they get in? So then you guys do kind of like a one click, hey, here it is, click it, and you're good to go. So something to keep in mind. So other than that, if anybody has any questions, it's time to ask any questions you might have to Alex, Elliot, or to me. Or any final thoughts from Alex or Elliot?
I will leave space for questions since I've talked too much. Elliot, you got anything that you want to leave them with?
So sorry about that. Yeah, so everyone focuses a lot on authentication. Authentication is really, really good to focus on. You also need to focus on post-authentication because post-authentication is where all your side channel attacks exist. So you can have unphishable credentials, yes, but what is that represented as after you're authenticated? Usually a cookie, maybe an access token, maybe some file that gets placed on your hard drive. And if they steal that, it doesn't matter how much good authentication security is in place. You still have to protect the post-auth also because you can just bypass authentication. You don't even need to authenticate if you steal the access token that is generated afterwards, or the cookie, or whatever your session credential is. So don't forget about your post auth. That's where the bad guys like to play because they don't have to guess your password. They just are in. They are you once they have access to your hard drive. So just keep that in mind is what I would highly recommend.
So thank you guys for joining us. Thank you to the Moot team for joining us into this webinar. And thank you for anybody that is watching live or watching this on YouTube later.
Yep. Thanks, Kitos. Always a pleasure, Yigal.
Always a pleasure. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.